They called me a failure for years. Now my success exposes their true colors, sparks greed, and forces me to make the hardest decision I've ever faced. Growing up, my parents only had room for one success story, and that title was glued to my older brother, Ethan. Ethan was the star athlete, the straight-A student, the golden boy who could do no wrong. And me? I was Mark, the kid who liked drawing comics, struggled with math, and could never seem to meet their expectations. From as early as I can remember, the comparisons were relentless. My dad would say things like, "Why can't you be more like Ethan?" or, "You're just lazy, Mark. You'll never get anywhere with that attitude." My mom wasn't much better, constantly sighing and muttering about how disappointing I was if I brought home anything less than a perfect report card. By the time I hit high school, they weren't just suggesting I wasn't good enough, they were outright saying it. Ethan got a big party when he got into college on a football scholarship, and I got, well, nothing. I still remember the day I told them I wanted to go to art school. My dad actually laughed and said, "Art school? What kind of failure chooses that?" My mom shook her head and told me I was wasting my life. The worst part was, I started to believe them. I thought maybe they were right, that I really was a failure. It was like trying to climb a mountain with someone constantly shoving you back down. When I was 17, things hit a breaking point. It was during a screaming match with my dad about how I wasn't going to college, like a real man. I finally snapped and said, "If I'm such a disappointment, why do you even care what I do?" That night, I packed a duffel bag and left. I didn't have a solid plan, just a part-time job, a few $100, and a determination to prove them wrong. I didn't even say goodbye to Ethan. It felt like the only way I'd ever escape being the family screw-up was to cut myself off completely. When I left home, I didn't have much more than the clothes in my bag, a sketch pad, and sheer desperation to prove them wrong. I crashed at a friend's place for a week before landing a minimum-wage job washing dishes at a diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I worked double shifts, scraping grease off plates during the day and sketching logos and designs at night. I'd always loved art, but now I was determined to turn it into something real. I couldn't afford fancy art school classes, so I taught myself using free tutorials online and books I borrowed from the library. Every spare minute, I was hustling, learning graphic design, building a portfolio, and sending out work to anyone who would look at it. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, questioning if I was making the right choices. My parents' voices played in my head like a broken record, "You'll never make it. You're wasting your time." But instead of breaking me, those words pushed me. I wanted so badly to prove them wrong. After a year of grinding, I got my first freelance gig, designing a logo for a small bakery. They paid me $50, but to me, it felt like $1 million. That gig led to another, and then another. Before I knew it, I was building momentum. By the time I turned 21, I'd saved enough to move into my own apartment, a tiny studio that smelled like mold, but it was mine. Around that time, I landed a part-time role at a small marketing agency. The pay wasn't great, but it was my first step into the professional world. I threw myself into the work, taking on projects no one else wanted and teaching myself everything I could about branding and advertising. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something right. I wasn't just surviving, I was building. And I was doing it without my family's help, which made every success feel even sweeter. But I never reached out to them. Not once. As far as they knew, I'd disappeared. I told myself I'd only go back when I had something to show them, when I wasn't a failure anymore. By the time I hit 24, I'd landed a full-time role at a mid-sized marketing agency. It wasn't glamorous, but the paycheck was steady, and I was finally starting to feel like I had a real career. I worked harder than anyone in that office, often staying late to refine campaigns or pitch new ideas. One day, everything changed. I pitched a rebranding campaign for a small tech company that the agency had almost written off as a low-priority client. I put weeks into that presentation, pulling together sleek designs, a new logo, and a full social media strategy. The client loved it, and suddenly, I wasn't just the guy who stayed late, I was the rising star. That campaign won the agency a major award, and with that recognition came opportunities. Within months, I was promoted to lead designer, and by 26, I'd saved enough money to start my own firm. It was terrifying to leave the security of my job, but I figured, why stop here? I threw myself into building something bigger. I hired a small team, focused on quality over quantity, and started networking like my life depended on it. Slowly but surely, we started landing bigger clients. Then came the first six-figure deal, a massive campaign for a national brand. I felt like I'd finally made it. But success is strange, it shines a spotlight, and suddenly people start noticing you. That's exactly what happened when I posted about one of my projects on LinkedIn. Somehow, my mom saw it. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a LinkedIn notification. My mom had somehow found my profile, and I saw her name in the likes under a post I had shared about a recent campaign. It was surreal. This was the same woman who used to scoff at my interest in art, and now she was quietly lurking, acknowledging my work. A few days later, I got a text from her. It wasn't long, just a simple message saying she had seen my work and was proud of me. Proud. That word stuck in my throat. This was the same family that had called me a failure for years. Now, with a few clicks on a career post, everything was suddenly different. I didn't reply, but I didn't block her either. I wasn't sure how I felt, curious, angry, maybe even a little hopeful. But whatever it was, I kept quiet and carried on. The next message came later that week. This time, she mentioned my dad's car breaking down and asked if I could help. It was framed casually, like it was no big deal. I debated for hours, but eventually, I sent over enough to cover the repairs. It wasn't a lot, and I told myself I was just being practical. For a moment, I thought that might be the end of it. I'd helped them, and maybe that meant we were even. But deep down, I already knew better. After the first transfer, I thought things would go back to silence. But once the door was cracked open, the flood began. At first, it was small. A message here and there about how they were glad I was doing well or how proud they were of me. But soon, the requests followed. It was never framed as outright begging. Instead, they packaged it with guilt and nostalgia, reminding me of family responsibilities. One day it was a few $100s to help with a dental bill. Another time, it was groceries because things had been tight. The requests felt relentless. They'd always start small, manageable amounts that didn't feel worth the fight, but they kept stacking up. And it wasn't just my parents. My brother Ethan joined in, asking if I could help him out of a tight spot when his credit card was maxed. I tried to tell myself I was just helping family, that it was the right thing to do. But each time I sent the money, it came with this sick, sinking feeling. They weren't reaching out to check on me or rebuild a relationship, they just wanted access to my wallet. I started to feel like a bank, not a son or brother. It was like my worth had been distilled down to the zeros in my bank account, and the bitterness I thought I'd left behind was creeping back in. I knew it wasn't sustainable. Something had to give. The requests didn't just continue, they grew. After the initial small asks, my parents started dropping hints about larger needs. It started with vague comments about how their house needed some repairs or how the HVAC system was on its last legs. Then came the outright asks. My dad sent a long message explaining how the roof needed replacing and how they just couldn't afford it. He mentioned how lucky I was to be in a position to help and how it would mean so much if I could step in. At first, I said no, which led to a guilt trip that hit harder than I expected. My mom chimed in, emphasizing how much they had sacrificed for me growing up, a laughable claim, given how they treated me. Against my better judgment, I sent the money for the roof, telling myself it would be the last time. But it wasn't. Not long after, my brother Ethan called. He'd always been the golden boy, but now he was in financial trouble. He needed money for a down payment on a house, something about wanting his kids to grow up in a better neighborhood. I was stunned. This wasn't a few $100s for a car repair, this was a 5-figure request. When I said no, Ethan didn't take it well. He accused me of being selfish, of forgetting where I came from. He even hinted that I owed him for all the pressure he had to endure growing up as the successful one. I felt cornered, like no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. The golden child, the parents who'd written me off for years, they all suddenly wanted something from me. And the more I gave, the more they demanded. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about control. It all came to a head one afternoon when I got an email from my mom. It wasn't a request this time, it was a demand. She and my dad had been talking, and they decided they needed a new house. Their current one was too small, too old, and not befitting of their son's success. She laid it all out, explaining how much the down payment would be and how they were sure I'd step up for the family. The number was absurd, easily 6 figures. I read the email twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. I felt my blood boiling. All those years of being told I was a disappointment, a failure, and now they had the audacity to demand I buy them a house. Not ask, demand. I ignored the email, hoping they'd get the hint. They didn't. A few days later, my dad called, leaving a voicemail about how ungrateful I was being. He reminded me of all the support they'd given me, all the sacrifices they'd made, and how this was the least I could do in return. Ethan joined in, calling to say how disappointed he was that I wasn't helping our parents. He painted himself as the dutiful son, trying to make me feel like the selfish one. I was done. The years of guilt, manipulation, and emotional blackmail had finally hit a wall. I realized that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. They didn't want a relationship, they wanted access to my success, nothing more. That was the moment I decided it was time to confront them head-on. I knew avoiding them wouldn't solve anything, so I decided to face it directly. I called a family meeting, my parents and Ethan. No more texts, emails, or voicemails. I wanted to lay everything out in person, once and for all. We met at my parents' house. The moment I walked in, the tension was thick. My mom started with her usual overly sweet tone, thanking me for coming around, and saying how excited they were to talk about the new house. Ethan was already sitting at the table, looking smug, like he thought he was about to team up with them against me. I let them talk first. My dad jumped in about the down payment, talking as if it was a done deal, while my mom chimed in about how they'd already started looking at properties. It was clear they expected me to just roll over and write the check. When they finished, I stayed quiet for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Then I said, "This stops here." At first, they were confused. I told them I wasn't going to buy them a house. I wasn't going to be their ATM anymore. I explained how I'd spent years working my way up from nothing, all while they sat on the sidelines, mocking and dismissing me. "You don't get to treat me like a failure for most of my life and then show up when I'm successful, acting like I owe you something," I said. My dad's face turned red. He started shouting about how ungrateful I was and how everything I'd achieved was because of the discipline they gave me growing up. My mom jumped in with tears, claiming they only wanted to give me a chance to give back to the family. Ethan, as expected, played the victim, saying I was making things harder on him by not helping. He said I was turning my back on them, abandoning the people who had always been there for me. That was when I lost it. I laid it all out, every insult, every time they dismissed my dreams, every moment they made me feel like I wasn't good enough. I told them I didn't owe them anything, and if they couldn't see me as a person instead of a bank account, I wanted nothing to do with them. The room went silent. My dad looked like he wanted to explode, but for once, he didn't have anything to say. My mom just stared at me with watery eyes, and Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I didn't wait for them to reply. I grabbed my coat, walked out, and didn't look back. After the confrontation, I thought I'd feel relief, like a weight had been lifted. Instead, I felt raw. The drive home was silent except for the noise in my head, a mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. I replayed every word they'd said, every excuse they made, and every time they tried to twist the blame back onto me. The fallout began almost immediately. My phone blew up with messages and voicemails from my mom. At first, she played the guilt card, reminding me how much family means, and how hurt they were by my behavior. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. She accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and forgetting where I came from. Ethan was even worse. He posted on social media about how some people forget their roots once they make money. It was clearly aimed at me, and mutual friends started reaching out, asking what was going on. Some of them even took his side, saying I should help my family because I could afford it. It wasn't just them either. My extended family got involved. Aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years sent me messages saying I was being too harsh and needed to make amends. Apparently, my mom had been calling everyone, painting herself and my dad as victims of my heartless behavior. For weeks, it felt like I couldn't escape it. Every message, every comment, every accusation dragged me back into the toxic cycle I thought I'd left behind. But even through the noise, I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to give in. It hurt, but I realized the fallout wasn't about me. It was about their loss of control. They couldn't use me anymore, and they didn't know how to handle it. After weeks of constant messages, I made a decision: I had to set firm boundaries, or I'd never have peace. Ignoring them clearly wasn't working, they were relentless, trying every trick in the book to wear me down. I sat down one evening and wrote out everything I wanted to say. I wanted to be clear, direct, and leave no room for interpretation. Then I sent the same message to my mom, dad, and Ethan. I explained that I wasn't responsible for solving their problems. I told them I was done being treated like a bank account, and if they couldn't respect that, we wouldn't have a relationship moving forward. I laid it all out, how their years of dismissing me, mocking my dreams, and treating me as less than had shaped my decision. I told them I wasn't cutting them off because I was angry or spiteful, but because their behavior had become toxic, and I needed to protect my own well-being. The response was predictable. My mom sent me a long, dramatic reply about how I was abandoning my family. My dad texted me to say I was being disrespectful, and Ethan didn't bother replying at all, he just posted another passive-aggressive status about selfish people. Despite their reactions, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time, I'd said everything I needed to say without backing down. The ball was in their court now, and I was done carrying the weight of their expectations. It wasn't easy. There were moments I second-guessed myself, wondering if I was being too harsh. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about money, it was about breaking a lifetime of toxic dynamics. After I sent that message, the silence was almost worse than the guilt-laden texts and calls. For a few days, I didn't hear from anyone. I knew my family too well to think they'd let it go, but I couldn't predict how they'd respond to this new boundary. The first crack came from my mom. She sent me a long email detailing how hard things were for them and how I was being cruel by refusing to help. She dredged up every supposed sacrifice they'd made for me, twisting the narrative to make it seem like I owed them everything. It was manipulative, full of exaggerated claims and outright lies. Then Ethan got involved. He texted me out of the blue with a simple line: "So, you're really just going to walk away from family?" When I didn't reply, he doubled down, calling me selfish and throwing in some personal jabs for good measure. "It's not like you ever had it hard," he said in one message. "You're acting like a victim, but you've got it all now. Must be nice to forget where you came from." The worst part was, they didn't stop there. They started reaching out to mutual friends, trying to turn people against me. A few friends sent me screenshots of group chats where Ethan had been venting, painting me as the bad guy who abandoned the family after getting rich. It stung, but it also solidified my decision. Their behavior wasn't about reconciling or mending relationships, it was about maintaining control. I realized they didn't care about me as a person, they only cared about what I could provide. This time, I didn't respond to any of it. I left the messages unread, ignored the calls, and let their comments roll off my back. I wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. Even though I held my ground, the whole situation left me emotionally drained. It's hard to admit, but a part of me still craved their approval. That part wanted to believe they'd change, apologize, or even acknowledge the pain they'd caused. Instead, they acted like I was the villain. Their manipulation, guilt-tripping, and public shaming took a toll on me. There were nights I lay awake, questioning whether I'd done the right thing. I'd think about childhood memories, of my mom reading me bedtime stories or my dad teaching me to ride a bike, and wonder how it all turned into this. The silence, when it came, wasn't the relief I'd expected. It was like a void, filled with echoes of all the times they dismissed me, belittled me, and made me feel small. And now, their behavior as adults only reinforced the reality, they didn't see me as a son or a brother. They saw me as a resource. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. Every time I thought about my family, there was this knot in my chest, anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of betrayal. I'd worked so hard to build a life I was proud of, but their inability to respect my boundaries made me feel like I'd never truly escaped their shadow. Despite everything, part of me felt guilty for cutting them off. I'd been conditioned my whole life to believe that family came first, no matter what. But now I was seeing the price of putting them first, and it was my peace, my happiness, and my sense of self-worth. I didn't owe them that anymore. It took a long time, but I finally came to a decision. I wasn't going to let my family's actions define me anymore. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life tethered to their demands, their guilt, or their distorted version of family loyalty. I knew that meant making some hard choices. The first was to cut off all financial assistance, no exceptions. For years, I had justified sending money as a way to help, but it had only enabled their behavior. If I kept giving, they'd never stop asking. The second was to limit contact. I wouldn't block them entirely, but I would control how and when we communicated. No more answering calls out of guilt or replying to manipulative messages. If they couldn't respect my boundaries, then they didn't get access to me. It felt brutal, but it was necessary. My family had shown me time and again that they weren't interested in a real relationship, only in what I could give them. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice my mental health, my peace, or my self-respect anymore. Making this decision wasn't easy. There was a small, stubborn part of me that still hoped for reconciliation. But I knew it wasn't possible unless they changed, and after years of disappointment, I wasn't holding my breath. So, I stuck to my plan. No more money. No more explanations. Just boundaries, firmly and unapologetically enforced. Once I put my plan into action, the backlash came fast. My family didn't take kindly to being cut off. My mom sent long, guilt-ridden emails about how I was tearing the family apart. My dad resorted to passive-aggressive messages, and Ethan. He went scorched earth on social media, airing out every detail of my life he could twist to make me look bad. For a while, I avoided even logging into my accounts because the negativity was overwhelming. Friends started reaching out, asking what was going on, some genuinely concerned and others clearly fishing for gossip. I stuck to my boundaries, repeating the same line to anyone who brought it up, "I'm not discussing this." It wasn't easy. There were moments when I second-guessed everything, especially when I saw posts from friends celebrating their own close-knit families. Birthdays and holidays were particularly hard. I'd see families gathered together, laughing and sharing moments, and I couldn't help but feel the sting of what I'd lost, or maybe never truly had. But as painful as it was, I also started to feel something I hadn't in years: peace. Without the constant demands and manipulation, I had space to focus on myself. My work flourished. My friendships deepened. And I finally started to feel like I was living life on my own terms, free from the weight of their expectations. I won't lie and say it was perfect. There were still nights when the silence felt deafening, when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But those moments were fleeting, and they were nothing compared to the constant stress I'd lived with before. The truth is, I realized I wasn't just cutting off toxic family members, I was choosing myself for the first time. Now, standing on the other side of all this, I've learned more about myself, and about family, than I ever thought I would. Cutting ties with my family wasn't just about setting boundaries, it was about reclaiming my life. For years, I let their opinions and expectations define me. Breaking away wasn't just a decision, it was freedom. I've come to terms with the fact that not every family is the warm, supportive unit we're led to believe they should be. Some families tear you down instead of building you up. Some love you only when it's convenient for them or when you're useful. And while that reality hurts, it's better than clinging to a fantasy that was never real. Do I wish things were different? Of course. I wish my family could have seen my success as an opportunity to reconnect, to support each other in healthier ways. But they didn't. They chose entitlement and manipulation over love and respect. What I've learned is this: family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who lift you up, who celebrate your wins, and who stand by you when you fail. I've found that family in friends, mentors, and even colleagues. They're the ones who make me feel like I belong, not for what I can give, but for who I am. If you're reading this and feel trapped in a similar cycle, here's what I'll say: you don't owe anyone your peace, your success, or your happiness, not even family. It's okay to set boundaries, and it's okay to walk away when those boundaries aren't respected. I'm finally at a place where I'm proud of myself, not just for what I've accomplished, but for the life I've built on my own terms. And honestly, that's the greatest success I could have ever hoped for. The chapter with my family is closed now, and while it's bittersweet, I'm at peace with it. Moving forward, I'll continue to choose people who choose me, not for what I can do for them, but for who I am. That's the family I want, and that's the life I'm living.